Ramesses, later known as Ramesses the Great, was born in the late 14th century BC, likely around 1303 BC, although his precise birth date remains unknown. His father belonged to a prominent aristocratic military family from northern Egypt, possibly one of the fortified urban centers in the Nile River Delta. His original name is uncertain, but he would eventually be known as Seti Ferpar. Ramesses' mother, Tuya, was the daughter of a military officer named Raya, placing her within the Egyptian military nobility. He was born into an era that marked one of the first golden ages of ancient times. This period represented the height of the Bronze Age, with powerful centralized states emerging across the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Greek world was dominated by powers like Mycenaeans and the Minoans, fostering complex literary and artistic societies that would shape the ancient world for centuries. In modern-day Turkey, the formidable Hittite Empire, centered in Hattusa, had risen to power. Shortly before Ramesses' birth, it had begun conquering parts of the Levant and Mesopotamia, becoming Egypt's main rival in the region. Further southeast, significant states existed in Mesopotamia and Persia, including the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. Each of these entities was wealthy, possessed complex bureaucracies, and engaged in extensive trade. A merchant in a city like Tyre or Sidon could purchase pottery from Knossos, olive oil from Athens, papyrus from Egypt, and textiles from Mesopotamia and Persia, all traded using copper, gold, and silver mined in regions such as western Anatolia under Hittite control, or Cyprus, a crucial copper mining hub necessary for the production of bronze chariots, weapons, and utensils. Egypt was also thriving during this era known as the New Kingdom period, which began in the 16th century BC and extended beyond Ramesses' lifetime. The term New Kingdom, a 19th century invention, accurately describes a distinct period of Bronze Age culture in Egypt characterized by unprecedented prosperity, even surpassing the Old Kingdom culture of the pyramid-building pharaohs of Giza. During this time, the pharaohs established a powerful government led by viziers and scribes. A large military, equipped with chariots and bronze weapons, was also maintained. This enabled the pharaohs to collect more taxes, govern more efficiently, and expand the empire into Nubia, modern Sudan, and acquire territory on the Sinai Peninsula and in Canaan and Lebanon. This empire peaked in the 15th century BC under Pharaoh Thutmose III, whose conquests extended the kingdom into parts of modern-day Syria and northern Iraq. Details about Ramesses' childhood are scarce, but the political developments of the time were significant. At his birth, Egypt was ruled by Pharaoh Horemheb of the 18th dynasty. Horemheb is remembered for restoring stability to Egypt after a period of turmoil caused by Akhenaten, who had attempted to establish a monotheistic cult of the sun, disrupting Egypt's traditional religious and political structures. This led to unrest and a decline in Egypt's international power. Horemheb reversed Akhenaten's decisions and quelled the unrest, but he had no surviving sons to succeed him. He chose Paramess, his grand vizier and Ramesses' grandfather, as his successor. Thus, the family ascended to become the 19th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs, when Paramess became Pharaoh Ramesses I around 1292 BC. After a brief reign, Paramess died, and Ramesses' father succeeded him as the second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, taking the name Seti I in honor of the Egyptian god of war, Seth. Ramesses was now the heir to the throne, appointed as prince regent by his father. Seti I reigned for just over a decade, during which he began to re-establish Egyptian control over territories in Canaan and Syria, territories that had been held by earlier rulers like Thutmose III, but which had been lost due to the kingdom's instability during Akhenaten's reign. Ramesses likely accompanied his father on campaigns into the Levant, gaining valuable military experience as prince regent. This experience would soon be crucial as he ascended to the throne as a relatively young man. He became pharaoh on the 27th day of the season of the harvest, believed to be May 31st, 1279 BC. He would reign for the next 66 years, marking what is considered the most significant reign of any Egyptian pharaoh. He adopted the full regnal name User Matre Seta Penre, meaning the law or harmony of Ra, the Egyptian sun god, is powerful. I am chosen of Ra. Ramesses' first major action as ruler was to address a growing threat in the northern parts of the kingdom. Even before his accession, Sheridan sea pirates had been raiding the northern coast and the Nile Delta from the eastern Mediterranean. This region was one of the most important and prosperous parts of Ramesses' kingdom, making it essential to stop these incursions. Starting in the second year of his reign, he established forts along the northern coast and northeast towards Sinai and Canaan. He also constructed new ships to patrol the eastern Mediterranean and set up warning posts to alert settlements of incoming raiding parties. This culminated in a major naval battle, which Ramesses won. A stele at Tanis commemorates this victory, but details of the battle remain unclear. With the northern shores secured, Ramesses focused on restoring Egyptian control over Canaan and other parts of the Levant. This was a critical objective. While Egypt was a wealthy land due to agriculture along the Nile and the production of pottery and papyrus in cities like Thebes and Memphis, the wealthiest cities of the Late Bronze Age were in Canaan. Cities like Tyre and Sidon, which were located at the crossroads of the major empires and major trading centers. As a result, Ramesses was determined to restore Egyptian rule over the region, similar to the time of Thutmose III. However, while no state within Canaan and the southern Levant had an army capable of withstanding Egypt, the Hittite Empire to the north also coveted the region. Much of Ramesses' rule was marked by efforts to seize control of this region and repel Hittite counterattacks, leading to what is arguably the most significant battle of the Bronze Age. Early in his reign, Ramesses constructed a new capital in the northeastern Nile Delta to strengthen Egyptian power in the Levant. The capital of Pharaonic Egypt had shifted over the centuries. During the Old Kingdom period, it was located at Memphis near modern-day Cairo. During the New Kingdom period, the capital was typically located further down the River Nile at Thebes, which we now call Luxor. Akhenaten had established a new capital at Amarna as a center of his new religion. Thus, there was a precedent for moving the capital of the Pharaonic kingdom. Ramesses named his new capital Pi-Ramesses, located near modern-day Kontir. His father, Seti I, had previously maintained a summer palace in the region, and it is likely that Ramesses spent much of his youth there. In the 1270s, he established it as a quasi-military capital with workshops and factories producing weapons, armor, and chariots. Pi-Ramesses became an administrative capital of Lower Egypt, but Ramesses never abandoned the belief that Thebes or Luxor was the religious and spiritual capital of Egypt, as demonstrated by his building program. In the initial stages of his wars against the Hittites, Ramesses faced King Muwatalli II, who had been the ruler of the Hittite Empire since the mid-1290s. Muwatalli had moved his capital south from Hattusa to Tarhuntusa to be closer to Canaan, Syria, and the wider Levant. And like Ramesses, both rulers considered it to be a contested region. In the early years of his reign, Ramesses conducted annual military campaigns northeast from the Nile Delta. The first of these, around 1275 BC, resulted in him solidifying his control over southern Canaan before campaigning further north to the region around modern-day Beirut. Here, he erected a commemorative stele or pylon at Nahar el-Kalb. Although the text has been obliterated, it almost certainly proclaimed Ramesses' successes in campaigning this far north, a statement of Egypt's claims to control the region. Similarly, he engaged in further campaigns against the Amurru, a people who occupied much of what is now Syria, as vassals of King Muwatalli and the Hittites. However, whatever nominal control over this region Ramesses was able to establish in 1275 was ephemeral. No sooner had he withdrawn back to Pi-Ramesses at the end of the campaigning season than Egyptian influence in Syria effectively collapsed and the Hittites were able to reimpose themselves. The war between the Egyptians and the Hittites at this time has become widely renowned for a battle which it is generally accepted occurred in the year 1274 BC. This was the Battle of Kadesh, or Kadesh, near the city of Kadesh on the banks of the Orontes River in western Syria. The Battle of Kadesh was clearly a highly significant one, involving armies of a very substantial size by the standards of the Late Bronze Age, but also being regarded as a unique or significant event by the parties involved. It is, for instance, the best documented military encounter of the second millennium BC, with both sides making extensive records concerning it in years to come in the form of tablets, wall paintings, and inscriptions throughout Egypt and other parts of the Late Bronze Age world. Thus, the Battle of Kadesh was unquestionably believed by contemporaries to have been an era-defining military engagement. The background of the battle was Ramesses' new campaign into Syria in 1274 BC. As with the previous year's campaign, his goal was to extend Egyptian power further north into Syria at the expense of the Hittites. Ramesses led 4 divisions of troops into Canaan and then north towards Syria that year. These were named for some of the paramount Egyptian deities, Amun, Ra, Seth, and Ptah, and consisted of perhaps as many as 40,000 men, with 2,000 chariots also provided for the campaign. These were augmented by thousands of Canaanite mercenaries who joined the Pharaoh's forces. However, not all of these forces were deployed at Kadesh, and it seems probable that Ramesses' forces did not exceed 30,000 men in total on the field of battle. Arrayed against him was Muwatalli's army of somewhere between 25,000 and 45,000 men, with several thousand chariots also brought south into Syria. Consequently, the armies of the two sides were relatively evenly matched. A striking aspect of the engagement was the number of chariots deployed, with many Egyptologists and Hittite scholars speculating since that this was the largest chariot battle in history. In its initial stages, Ramesses was caught off guard at Kadesh. He received false intelligence about the location of the main Hittite army far to the north, whereas in fact, Muwatalli's armies were stationed near Old Kadesh, not far from the Egyptian advance party. As a result, when the Hittites attacked, some of Ramesses' main divisions of troops were far to the south and could not be brought into the field of battle. As a result, the Ra division was scattered by a Hittite chariot assault in the first stages of the battle near Kadesh. However, this is the point at which Ramesses' leadership is believed to have proved pivotal, as he steeled the Amun division of his troops and counterattacked against the Hittites, breaking their chariot assault. Some accounts have it that the fault also lay with the Hittites, who, believing that their initial attack had proved conclusive, had stopped to plunder the baggage trains and goods of the Ra division, leaving them exposed to Ramesses' coordinated counterattack. Thereafter, Muwatalli ordered his troops to retreat towards the Orontes River. Later, Egyptian accounts suggest that the Ptah division now arrived to Kadesh and harried the Hittites. Muwatalli ordered a new counterattack led by his chariot divisions, but this was unable to break the Egyptian advance. Eventually, the Hittites were forced to flee northwards over the river Orontes, in many cases throwing their weapons and armor aside in order to swim through the river to safety. It is unclear exactly how conclusive the alleged Egyptian victory at Kadesh was. Some Egyptologists believe that the battle was a major military victory for Ramesses. He certainly depicted it as such. For the rest of his long reign, the pharaoh consistently erected stelae and had inscriptions and wall paintings placed in temples and in his palaces depicting Kadesh as a great victory for Egypt in Syria. These include the Kadesh inscriptions or bulletin and the poem of Pentar, a prose account of the Egyptian victory which is repeated on the walls of temples all along the course of the River Nile. The poem is extant in 8 different places, while the bulletin is to be found inscribed in 7 different locations around Egypt. Consequently, it is clearly something which Ramesses tried to establish as the official version of his alleged victory at Kadesh. But other scholars of the late Bronze Age world are more skeptical, with some arguing that Kadesh was probably more of a stalemate than a victory for either side. Certainly it cannot have been the kind of comprehensive victory which Ramesses attempted to depict it as, for the battle did not lead to any major shift in the strategic situation in Syria. Rather, the Egyptians and the Hittites continued to contest the region for many years to come. The Battle of Kadesh did not bring the war between Egypt and the Hittite Empire to a complete conclusion, though it did signal the end of the most intense initial period of clashes between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Skirmishes continued for years thereafter. For instance, in 1269, BC Ramesses launched a new campaign into Syria during which he conquered the city of Dapur. However, the pattern during the 1260s was that Ramesses was able to briefly acquire control over parts of Syria while he campaigned personally there, but longer-term control over the region could not be maintained once the major Egyptian military presence was withdrawn. In recognition of this situation around 1259 BC, the Egyptians and the Hittites agreed to what is variously called either the Egyptian-Hittite Treaty or the Eternal Treaty or Silver Treaty. This was signed between Ramesses II and Hattusili III, who had succeeded as ruler of the Hittite Empire at some point in the 1260s. The Eternal Treaty effectively brokered a lasting peace, one in which the two powers agreed to cease hostilities as it was costing both governments exorbitant amounts of money and achieving little for either. Thus, Syria was to become a sphere of Hittite influence, with Egypt largely confirmed in its control of Canaan, and other more southerly parts of the Levant. Bonds were agreed and pledges made, and the gods invoked as overseers of the eternal peace. The Eternal Treaty is one of the most famed international agreements made in ancient times. This is owing to the highly unusual survival of multiple copies of the text over 3 millennia later in different languages. Copies of the text of the treaty in Egyptian hieroglyphics were found inscribed in 2 separate locations in Luxor in central Egypt in the first half of the 19th century. Then, in the first years of the 20th century, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler uncovered a copy of the text in the Akkadian language, the lingua franca of the Hittite Empire and other states of the Middle East in the 13th century BC, as part of a cache of approximately 10,000 tablets which were discovered while excavating the ancient Hittite capital at Hattusa in Turkey. Thus, we have a remarkable example here of an international treaty being copied out and deposited in royal archives and temples in cities 2,000 kilometers away from each other over 3,200 years ago. As to the motives of the respective parties, it is clear that both Ramesses and Hattusili had both come to believe that peace and the fostering of trade in the Levant would be more beneficial than a continuation of their rivalry, while both states were quite likely wary of the rise of the Assyrian Empire to the east in Mesopotamia, and believed a united front against this upstart power was better than ongoing warfare in Syria. The signing of the Eternal Treaty also provided a respite for Ramesses in order for him to concentrate militarily on matters to the south of Egypt. For roughly a millennium between the middle of the 3rd millennium BC down to roughly 1500 BC, the region of modern-day Sudan had been independent of Egypt. At the time, it was known as Nubia, and was dominated by the Kerma culture which produced states like the Kingdom of Kush. However, during the New Kingdom period, and in particular during the reign of Thutmose III, Nubia had gradually been brought more and more under the control of Pharaonic Egypt. As with Canaan and Syria, Egyptian control declined here as a result of the unrest created by Akhenaten's rule in the 14th century BC, but Ramesses was now in a position to reverse this situation. Early in his reign, he had already campaigned south of the first cataract of the Nile. These cataracts are a series of locations along the course of the River Nile where the whitewater rapids predominate, and were used at the time as intermediary points where Egyptian arms were extended as far as was possible in campaigns against the Nubians. By the 1260s, Ramesses had effectively extended Egyptian control as far as the Second Cataract, which lies south of Abu Simbel and Wadi Halfa in what is now northern Sudan. But the period following the establishment of the Eternal Treaty with the Hittites provided a military respite which allowed Ramesses to send forces further south again to the Third Cataract. This lies well into Sudan at the northern margin of the Dongola River. Here Ramesses was able to establish a southern military colony at Tombos, as evidenced by the discovery of pharaonic and royal inscriptions here in tombs built at the height of the New Kingdom in the 13th century BC. Thus, by the 1240s BC, Ramesses had effectively brought a significant amount of Nubia under outright Egyptian control. Ramesses was soon campaigning westwards as well. Our knowledge of Libya in ancient times is surprisingly limited for a region which was in close proximity to major centers of civilization such as Egypt and Crete. Generally speaking, the main settlement points here were a series of ports and oases along the north coast or slightly inland, but proximate to the Mediterranean Sea. The land here was known as Chehenu to the Egyptians. Libya is a name derived from later Greek descriptions of the region. Despite the lack of historical knowledge about the society that existed here in ancient times, there was significant contact between the Egyptians and Libya throughout the New Kingdom period, mostly in the form of Berber raids into the western branches of the Nile Delta and Egyptian efforts to establish coastal colonies along the north of Libya. Ramesses attempted to further this effort by establishing new forts along the Mediterranean coastline and reinforcing a fort at Zawiet el Rakam, which his father, Seti I, had established earlier after campaigning against the Libyan tribes of the region. In the course of Ramesses's reign, this became the major western extremity of the Egyptian kingdom, though trade centers and vassal states were to be found further to the west in Libya proper. These accomplishments, as with nearly everything else to do with Ramesses's military endeavors, were recorded in a series of stelae and other monumental inscriptions in southern and central Egypt later in his reign. With these campaigns in Nubia and Libya, and the earlier endeavors in Canaan and Syria, by the middle of his reign, Ramesses had succeeded in extending the Egyptian kingdom to the greatest point it had been at since the days of Thutmose III 2 centuries earlier. Beyond the pharaoh's core control of Egypt, his forces had moved south along the River Nile, effectively repossessing Nubia after it had broadly regained its independence during the period of instability under Akhenaten in the 14th century BC. Elsewhere, Ramesses had campaigned westwards into the deserts of the Sahara and along the north coast to bring Libya into a partial vassalage. However, it was his conquests to the northeast that were most substantial. Here, Ramesses had captured Canaan and much of Syria. It wasn't simply that this was one of the richest parts of the world at the time, with affluent trading cities like Tyre and Sidon, but in order to achieve some hegemony here, Ramesses had to defeat one of the most substantial powers of the ancient world, the Hittite Empire. In doing so, he carved out one of the largest territorial empires ever seen up to that time. Thus, in the late Bronze Age, Ramesses had arguably transformed New Kingdom Egypt into the most powerful state in the known world, a major achievement after the period of instability that had characterized Egypt as recently as the 14th century. Throughout his military campaigns of the 1270s, 1260s, and 1250s, Ramesses was accompanied by an ever-growing number of his sons. This is unsurprising when we consider that Ramesses is believed to have had approximately 100 children, of which a roughly equal amount were sons and daughters. Such a large brood was a byproduct of the practice of polygamy by ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Ramesses had many wives, the details of several of which are well known. For instance, his primary consort was Nefertari, the first of Ramesses' great royal wives. Her background is not precisely known, but some have speculated that she was descended from Pharaoh A, who had ruled Egypt 4 decades prior to Ramesses' accession as part of the 18th dynasty. She and Ramesses evidently married quite young, as she became queen consort as soon as he ascended to the throne around 1279 BC. They had many children together, and on the strength of the numerous temples and shrines which Ramesses had built in her honor, there is no doubting that she was the most revered of his wives. She is also somewhat unique as a queen consort of the New Kingdom period for whom we have extant correspondence. Nefertari wrote on multiple occasions to King Hattusili III, ruler of the Hittite Empire, and his wife, Puduhepa, in the 1260s and 1250s, and tablets of this correspondence have been unearthed in the Hittite capital Hattusa. Nefertari died around 1255, and since Ramesses lived for many decades to come, new great wives emerged in the years that followed. Paramount amongst these was Isetnofret. She too seems to have married Ramesses before his accession as pharaoh, but she was clearly a junior consort while Nefertari lived. Her seniority from the mid-13th century is attested to by numerous inscriptions and records of her, which appear on statues and temple walls across Egypt. Other great wives of the pharaoh emerged from political arrangements. For instance, as part of the Eternal Treaty of 1259 BC with the Hittites, Ramesses took one of the daughters of King Hattusili III and Queen Puduhepa as his wife, although the marriage to Mathornfurur was not solemnized until the mid-1240s BC, presumably as the Hittite king's daughter was considered to be too young for the marriage to be formalized in the early 1250s BC. Curiously enough, some of Ramesses' other great royal wives included some of his daughters. Bintanath, for instance, was born from Ramesses' marriage to Isetnofret, before later marrying her own father. Such familial relationships were common throughout the history of pharaonic Egypt and resulted in significant complications of inbreeding, the most famous example of which had been Tutankhamun 50 years before Ramesses' reign. Tutankhamun suffered from various physical ailments, likely resulting from the inbreeding prevalent in Ramesses II's family in the 13th century BC. This extensive royal family was closely tied to the cult of Ra, the sun god and a paramount deity in the Egyptian religious system, also worshipped as Amun-Ra. Ra, alongside other deities like Ptah and Horus, held immense importance during the New Kingdom. Ramesses' vast building projects from the 1260s onward consistently associated him with these particular deities. From the early 1240s BC, after ruling for over 3 decades, Ramesses also became the center of his own religious cult through the Sed festival or Feast of the Tail. This annual religious festival celebrated the reign of any pharaoh who had ruled for over 30 years, nominally in honor of the wolf god, Sed or Wepwawet. The festival's origins are somewhat morbid, possibly starting as a ritual where long-lived pharaohs were ritually murdered, with the idea being that once he reached a certain age, it was time for him to be removed from power. Over time, the festival shifted to honoring the king. Under Ramesses, the said festival was celebrated at Thebes for the first time in 1249 BC, and then every 3 years for the remainder of his life. Due to the length of his reign, he celebrated an unprecedented number of said festivals. While the first half of Ramesses' reign was largely defined by warfare and territorial expansion, the second half was notable for extensive building projects. Ancient Egypt is renowned for its architectural achievements, though they occurred sporadically. The first intermediate period, preceding the Middle Kingdom, saw few notable building projects. Conversely, the New Kingdom period, beginning in the 16th century BC, ushered in a new era of major construction commissioned by the pharaohs along the River Nile. Ramesses II was the leading figure of this pharaonic patronage of religious and mortuary architecture. His reign featured the most significant building program since the time of pharaohs like Cheops, who constructed the pyramid complex at Giza in the 26th century BC, including the Great Pyramid, the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. However, the monumental buildings constructed by Ramesses focused more on erecting temples, obelisks, and statues to honor the pharaoh and the gods, rather than giant pyramids as mortuary tombs. One of Ramesses's most important building projects was the Ramesseum at Thebes, the traditional capital of New Kingdom Egypt. Here, on the Theban necropolis, where many other pharaohs had constructed religious and mortuary buildings over the centuries, Ramesses had the Ramesseum built. Taking roughly 20 years to complete, it consisted of a temple with several courtyards, with large stone pylons and gateways leading from courtyard to courtyard, and a gigantic statue of Ramesses towering over the inner court. The temple itself consisted of 3 rooms with columns and terra-style cells dividing up the sanctuary, filled with statues of Egyptian gods and goddesses. Colossal statues of Ramesses once adorned the temple. Unfortunately, several of these were removed from Thebes in the 19th century and are now found in places in Europe, such as the British Museum. Reliefs commemorating Ramesses's victory at Kadesh and other accomplishments decorate what remains inside and outside the temple. What is particularly interesting about the Ramesseum is that there is evidence that a scribal school was also established here, while a small royal palace stood next to the courtyard, indicating that this was a site with several other uses beyond its religious functions. It clearly served as a center of pharaonic government in Thebes when Ramesses based himself out of the traditional New Kingdom capital. Ramesses also ordered some construction work at Saqqara. This is a site not far from the Great Pyramids of Giza and where the first major pyramid ever built in ancient Egypt, that of Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty, was built in the 27th century BC, and Saqqara remained a major center of monumental building work over the centuries. Ramesses decided to make his own contributions to the complexes here, in association with one of his eldest sons, Prince Kamweset. For instance, the pair had the Pyramid of Unas, a pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, who had lived in the 24th century BC, repaired and added an inscription to the southern facade of the edifice to indicate that they had overseen this restoration work. Ramesses and his son also enlarged the Temple of Serapis, or Serapeum, at Saqqara, a major center of the cult of Apis, the bull god of Egyptian mythology, who was believed to be the physical manifestation of Ptah, the Egyptian god of crafts, merchants, and the dead. Recent archaeological discoveries at Saqqara have also unearthed the tomb of Ptah-Emwia, who served for a time as Grand Vizier and Treasurer in the government of Ramesses II. His was not the only tomb built at Saqqara for senior government officials of Ramesses's reign, and the site at Saqqara highlights the esteem such bureaucrats were held in at the height of the New Kingdom in ancient Egypt. One of the most significant aspects of Ramesses's building program was the manner in which he used grand temples and buildings as a way of expressing the extension of Egyptian power into regions which had largely become independent of pharaonic rule in the 14th century BC. This was particularly the case to the south towards Nubia, along the course of the River Nile. Ramesses had many temples constructed here, on the way to what is now Sudan, as an expression of the rejuvenation of Egyptian rule here. One of the most impressive was the Temple of Beit el-Wali, which was built on an island in the middle of the River Nile just a few kilometers from Aswan in southern Egypt. This was dedicated to some of the foremost Egyptian deities of the New Kingdom period: Amun-Ra, Re-Horakti, Khnum, and Anuket. It is notable for having some of the best preserved and most impressive wall painting reliefs from ancient Egypt, many of which depict Ramesses' campaigns into Nubia and his subjugation of the region. His campaigns into Syria and Libya are also depicted. Over 100 kilometers to the south, on the west bank of the River Nile, Ramesses had the two temples of Wadi as-Sebwa also constructed, renovating one earlier temple in the process. The site here was used as a stop-off point for boats traversing the Nile to and from Nubia. Ramesses thus had the temples constructed in a location where many people visited and dedicated them both to himself and Amun-Ra. Perhaps the most striking architectural feature here are rows of sphinxes, which depicted Ramesses as individuals entered and left the temples. Perhaps the greatest building project undertaken by Ramesses, though, lay far to the south of Luxor, near what is now the border between Egypt and Sudan at the Second Nile Cataract. This was the temple complex near what was then known as Ipsambul, but which we know today as Abu Simbel. Here, Ramesses had initiated the construction of two temples back in the mid-1260s. They would take 20 years to complete, but eventually resulted in two large temples carved in a sheer rock face near the village. One of these was dedicated to Ramesses himself, and the smaller one was in honor of the pharaoh's primary consort, Queen Nefertari. When it was completed in 1244 BC, the Great Temple was inscribed as having been built as, quote, the Temple of Ramesses, beloved of Amun. It consisted of a grand entrance which led into a temple dedicated to several of the major Egyptian deities. Sculptures and reliefs adorned the interior. It is also believed that the temple was built in such a way that the chamber flooded with sunlight on the 22nd of October and the 22nd of February every year, illuminating the statues here. It is speculated that these dates are significant as possibly being the dates of Ramesses' birth and coronation as pharaoh. Moreover, the reliefs and sculptures are celebratory of Ramesses' reign, with his military campaigns and his victories depicted on the walls, notably the Battle of Kadesh. While the interior of the Temple of Abu Simbel is impressive, the most notable aspect of the temple complex is the series of colossal statues, which were erected on either side of the main entrance outside the temple. At the Grand Temple, there are 4 such colossal statues, 2 to either side of the entrance. All 4 of these depict Ramesses and stand approximately 20 meters tall, making them some of the largest pharaonic statues ever carved during the 3 millennia of ancient Egyptian history. It is difficult to get a precise idea of how vast these statues are from looking at photographs, but if one stands next to them, an individual only reaches up to the pharaoh's feet, with the remainder of the statues towering well above. On each statue, Ramesses was depicted wearing the dual crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, a statement here in the border region between Egypt and Nubia, that the pharaoh was lord of the land of the River Nile, both to the south and the north. Thus, the Temple of Abu Simbel was meant as a statement of Ramesses' power and rule over Egypt, a proclamation of sorts to those south of Abu Simbel that the pharaohs reigned here yet again. Abu Simbel is the pinnacle of Ramesses' building program. Ramesses' reign is notable for its length. Having most likely succeeded his father in 1279 BC, he is believed to have ruled for over 65 years. However, what is somewhat unusual about this long reign is how unremarkable the second half of it was, and in particular the last 2 decades or so of Ramesses' reign. All of the notable events of his time as pharaoh, from the Battle of Kadesh to the Eternal Treaty, and the campaigns west to Libya and south into Nubia, all occurred in the first 20 or so years of his rule. Even the monumental building programs which he undertook at Abu Simbel, Thebes, and elsewhere, although many of them took upwards of 20 years to complete, were generally finished by the early 1230 BC. By way of comparison, the last 20 or so years of Ramesses II's reign are something of a mystery. There is little evidence of major events or what he may have been doing. This is quite possibly because the pharaoh spent many years ill towards the end of his life and with his health declining. Scientific analysis of his mummy in recent times has revealed that Ramesses suffered from a range of ailments in old age, including arthritis, atherosclerosis, and severe dental issues. But he survived for an immense amount of time despite these illnesses. Such evidence as we have indicates Ramesses II did not die until 1213 BC in the 66th year of his reign, probably aged around 90, an extraordinarily long life by the standards of the time. He was originally interred in the Valley of the Kings, where many pharaohs were interred in the hills outside Thebes, but owing to looting of the graves here, his body was moved on several occasions. Like all the ancient pharaohs, he was mummified, meaning that his body was partially preserved across the centuries. Ramesses was succeeded by his son, Merneptah, who took the regnal name Ba-en-Re Meri Netjeru, which means the soul of Ra, beloved of the gods. This Merneptah is believed to have been the 13th son of Ramesses, a development which should have placed him well down the pecking order of possible successors to his father. However, Ramesses had lived for so long that a huge number of his older sons had died. Indeed, Merneptah was probably well into his 60s by the time of his own accession, and his reign would only last 10 years. The most significant development during his reign was a victory which he won over the tribes of Libya at the Battle of Perire in 1208 BC. Thereafter, there was a quick succession of pharaohs before the 19th dynasty came to an end, with the dying out of Ramesses' direct line of descent in 1189 BC. Thus, the dynasty lasted for just over a century and was completely dominated by the reign of Ramesses II. However, in recognition of the extraordinary reign of Ramesses the Great, many pharaohs of the 20th dynasty adopted his regnal name. In all, there were eventually 11 Ramesses, the last being Ramesses XI of the 20th dynasty, who died around 1077 BC. In death, Ramesses II has acquired an even greater historical fame over the years, as it has been regularly speculated that he is the pharaoh of the story of the Book of Exodus in the Old Testament. This is one of the earliest sections of the Old Testament and is central to both Judaism and Christianity. In it, the story of the Jews who are effectively living as slaves in what is termed the land of Goshen, but which is pharaonic Egypt, is related. This picks up from the book of Genesis, which had related how Joseph, the son of the Hebrew prophet Jacob, had been tricked by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt. Over the next several generations, a large community of Jewish slaves came to live in Egypt under the subjugation of the Egyptian pharaohs. In Exodus, we read the story of how the Jewish prophet Moses is placed in a reed basket and sent down the river Nile by his mother, Jochebed, after the Pharaoh had ordered the murder of Jewish children following concern about the number of Jews or Israelites that were then present in Egypt. Moses is subsequently found and adopted into the Pharaoh's household, where he gains the affection of the Egyptian king, but Moses clashes with the Pharaoh's biological son. Eventually, he realizes he is one of the Israelites and leads his people out of Egypt by parting the Red Sea as the Pharaoh's forces attempt to chase him. The debate on Ramesses is whether he could be identified as being either the ruling pharaoh of the Book of Exodus or his biological son, who becomes Moses' rival. There is really no substantive case, however, in either instance for speculating to this effect. The Book of Exodus makes no effort to identify the historical figures who might have been involved in pharaonic Egypt at the time, and the historicity of the events of the Old Testament are, of course, open to speculation as well. Consequently, different writers have speculated that a wide range of pharaohs dating from as early as the 17th century BC and as late as the 12th century BC may be the pharaoh of the Book of Exodus or his biological son. An unusually high proportion of people have been anxious to suggest it was Ramesses II, who was the pharaoh at the time, with this line being favored in more than one prominent Hollywood treatment of Moses' life, notably the Ten Commandments of 1956, in which Ramesses was depicted by Yul Brynner. These depictions are largely due to Ramesses being the most prominent pharaoh of this age. His reign was lengthy, and he was involved in military conquests in the Levant, which would fit with oppression of the Israelites. These things aside, though, there is no historical basis for suggesting that Ramesses II is the pharaoh of the Book of Exodus. Indeed, that Ramesses should be identified with the biblical pharaoh of Exodus is perhaps fitting. After all, much of the tale of Moses portends doom for Egypt for impeding the destiny of the Israelites to return to their ancestral homeland and establish a new kingdom there. And there is no doubting that New Kingdom Egypt quickly headed towards a period of immense decline shortly after Ramesses' reign. Beginning around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant and adjoining areas were struck by a series of attacks by a mysterious confederation of warlike people who have typically been identified as the Sea Peoples. There is no consensus even today as to who these people were or where they had come from, although it has plausibly been speculated that they came eastwards from the western Mediterranean, possibly from Italy and parts of southern France or the northwestern Balkans. Wherever they came from, what we do know is that the onslaught of these newcomers, along with the arrival of other warlike peoples such as the Dorians who came from northern Greece around this time, was an immediate threat to the late Bronze Age world and began to destabilize societies such as those of New Kingdom Egypt in the decades that followed. What followed is typically referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse in the historiography of the ancient world, as the powerful states which had dominated the region for several centuries either declined dramatically or collapsed. The Hittite Empire splintered into several smaller states during the course of the 12th century BC, while Bronze Age Mycenae and the Minoan civilization of Crete were almost entirely destroyed. New Kingdom Egypt also entered a period of pronounced decline, though it survived as a substantial polity, albeit much weakened internally, divided by civil wars and reduced in terms of its territorial expanse. This reflected much of what occurred elsewhere. Trade collapsed across the Bronze Age world for the space of 2 centuries or more, and the economy was so impacted that whole cities were abandoned and famines struck many regions, such that many historians of the ancient past refer to this as being a dark age of the ancient world, similar to what followed the collapse of the Roman Empire nearly 2 millennia later. What is known as the Third Intermediate Period of Egyptian history followed the end of the New Kingdom as new regional powers began to dominate what remained of Pharaonic Egypt, some of them hailing from Nubia in the south. Ramesses II's tomb was discovered during the late 19th century. This was a time when Egyptology, the study of Pharaonic Egypt, was entering its first golden age following the deciphering of Egyptian hieroglyphics using the Rosetta Stone. The great pharaoh's tomb was discovered at Deir el-Bahari in 1881 near Thebes, within a wider cache of royal tombs dating to the New Kingdom period. Ramesses' tomb, like nearly all other pharaohs, had been looted at some stage in the past and revealed nothing to rival the riches of that of Tutankhamun, which would be discovered 40 years later by Howard Carter. However, Ramesses' tomb is nevertheless significant, particularly a series of inscriptions on the sarcophagus, which listed Ramesses' various names and titles, and also provided an inventory of his burial goods. The inscriptions also indicate that Ramesses was not immediately interred at Deir el-Bahari, but rather he was first laid to rest in the tomb of his father, Seti III. It remained there for the next 80 years, until such time in the mid-12th century that his tomb was relocated. What is especially strange about all of this is that Egyptologists now believe that the wooden and painted death mask and sarcophagus used in Ramesses' new tomb were actually recycled from the tomb of one of his near successors, Horemheb, the last ruler of the 18th dynasty. It is also evident that renovations were carried out on Ramesses' tomb in subsequent years, indicating that the ancient Egyptians did not simply seal the tombs of dead pharaohs for all time when they were laid to rest, but viewed some of these tombs as shrines which were to be maintained and improved where possible. Unsurprisingly, given the extent of the building program he oversaw, Ramesses II has continued to feature regularly in studies of ancient Egypt and new archaeological projects. Indeed, in the case of Abu Simbel, his temple here was central to one of the most extraordinary relocation projects ever undertaken. In the 1950s, the new government of General Abdel Nasser, who had seized power in Egypt following the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, determined to build a vast new dam at Aswan in order to henceforth control the annual flooding or inundation of the River Nile on which so much of the country's agriculture depended. The resulting flooding and the creation of what was to be named Lake Nasser near the dam would have submerged Abu Simbel. Accordingly, in 1959, the Egyptian government applied to UNESCO to move the temple. This petition was granted, and over the next several years, several Swedish engineering firms undertook the project for the Egyptian government. The work involved was highly complex, as Abu Simbel was not constructed out of blocks of stone, but was carved into a cliff face. Thus, the temple was rescued by effectively making a giant incision into the mountainside, and then transplanting the temple piece by piece to a site several hundred meters inland and much higher above ground. Thus, Abu Simbel now overlooks the River Nile much as it has for over 3 millennia, but from a different vantage point and site. Owing to the length of his reign and its significance, Ramesses has also featured extensively in modern popular culture. For instance, Norman Mailer's Ancient Evenings, published in 1983 by the American author, was an enormous fictional account of pharaonic Egypt set on one evening in the late 12th century BC, but in which the characters repeatedly discuss the reign of Ramesses II. The Battle of Kadesh is a major feature of the work. Ramesses was also the subject of works by the noted historical fiction writer Christian Jacques, while he is the central character too of Anne Rice's The Mummy. So too does he appear in many numerous Hollywood treatments of ancient Egypt. But surely the most notable popular cultural reference to the victor of the Battle of Kadesh appeared 2 centuries ago in the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias, the Greek name for Ramesses. Here, Shelley used Ramesses as an example of how all great rulers are destined for decline or death. It was meant to be a reflection by Shelley primarily on Napoleon Bonaparte, who had fallen from power in France and Europe just a few years before Shelley's time of writing. But Shelley used Ramesses as his analogy as news was circulating around London at the time that the British Museum had just acquired one of the colossal heads of the Pharaoh from the Ramesseum. Shelley's repetition of the inscription which once adorned the tomb, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," must rank as amongst some of the most famous lines of 19th century poetry. Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, was arguably the greatest of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs, of which there were over 170 across 3 millennia. His reign is notable for many things. From a political and military perspective, he extended the Egyptian kingdom to the greatest point it had seen since the reign of Thutmose III 2 centuries earlier, the point at which Egypt reached its greatest extremity by conquering much of the Levant, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia. Ramesses did this primarily by defeating the Hittites in his nation's ongoing struggle with them for hegemony over the rich coastal cities of Canaan and Syria, such as Tyre and Sidon. The peak of his success in this respect was victory at the Battle of Kadesh and the Eternal Treaty of 1259 BC. But it was not just here where Ramesses was militarily successful. He also campaigned against the Shurden sea pirates early on in his reign, which had been plaguing the northern coast of Egypt for many years prior to his accession, and later campaigned westwards along the Mediterranean coast towards Libya. Finally, to the south, he extended the Egyptian kingdom's influence much further down the course of the River Nile into what is now Sudan, but which was then known as Nubia. This new kingdom empire of Ramesses II was one of the most formidable empires of ancient times. However, there is also the distinct possibility that Ramesses has been accorded the prominence which he has in studies of ancient Egypt and amongst Egyptologists owing to his own self-promotion. Ramesses was one of history's first great propagandists. There was no success which he achieved on the battlefield or aspect of his reign that he did not commemorate in stone in such a way as it would be remembered for centuries or even millennia to come. Thus, for instance, we find him setting stone stelae and other markers in the Nile Delta and the Levant to proclaim his victories over the Hittites and the Shurden sea pirates there to the world and to future generations. But it was his building program in places like Luxor, Saqqara, and above all, Abu Simbel, way down the Nile near Aswan, which afforded him his greatest legacy. Here in stone he proclaimed to all his magnificence as a ruler, his ties to the sun, god Ra, and his many military accomplishments. Yet while these building works may have been acts of propaganda, there is no denying their brilliance. Accordingly, from the perspective of the 21st century, surely Ramesses's greatest accomplishment was in having these magnificent temples, statues, and obelisks erected across Egypt nearly 3,500 years ago. What do you think of Ramesses the Great? Was he ancient Egypt's greatest pharaoh, or is the greatness of his legacy partly due to a shrewd policy of propaganda concerning his building projects as well as his promotion of his own military victories? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.